delighted to have you here today. What are CDP's priorities right now to promote AI development and adoption worldwide?
That is such a broad question, and I'd start by saying that, first of all, we recognize the incredible, important role that AI is going to play in our future, in the future of the world, in the future of the United States, in the future of our economy. I would say in every aspect of our lives, we know this, AI is going to play an incredibly important role. So the questions around who develops it, who controls it, on what systems is it running, those are really the fundamental issues that we're facing today. So we continue to look at AI development. A lot of people just want to skip to the end of the story. They want to skip to the question of LLMs. They want to skip to the question of ChatGPT and how can I build the next ChatGPT and essentially create the next unicorn, the element that's going to make money, that's going to fuel an economic development, and wherever you're talking about. But from our point of view, you have to build on a strong foundation. And that strong foundation has to do, first and foremost, of course, with digital infrastructure, which has been the bread and butter of our work for many years. So that is everything from undersea cables to advanced wireless networks, data centers, cloud, satellites. AI doesn't work without connectivity. I think that should go without saying, but somehow I feel like I always have to say that because you go and you talk to people and they always want to skip again to like, how do we build AI? And I'm like, well, you don't have good connectivity. You haven't done anything to block the development of untrusted technology landing on your shores. So let's start with the foundational elements of these things. And then you build up from there, right, to things like basic cybersecurity, right? Like, so it's great to have AI, but if you're building it on an insecure system, whether it's because of untrusted technology or because you have massive vulnerabilities in your systems, you're going to lose all the good work you're doing. Either it's going to be stolen through intellectual property theft, or it's going to be compromised through cybersecurity intrusions. And then I know we're talking about data, and it's not just because you teed me up on a data panel that I'm going to say it has to do with data. AI doesn't work without data. It doesn't work without data being exchanged. It doesn't work without data coming together. I hope everyone understands this, but I feel like you have to say it anyway. If you don't have the data to drive the AI, then it's not going to ultimately work. So we continue to discuss the importance of data policy around the world. And by that, I mean a couple of things. First of all, and I think I might be skipping ahead to a question later on, which is the question of whether the United States continues to believe in cross flows of data. And the answer is a resounding yes. When people say, oh, but you had the data security executive order, I say that doesn't impede the flow of data. What it does is it recognizes that data can be misused by our adversaries, and therefore we need to build into it the idea of data free flow with trust, which, by the way, was not a US conception, but just because other people have good ideas doesn't mean we can't embrace them. So we've embraced the idea of data free flow with trust. We've also built out our data sharing situation through something called the Cross-Border Data Privacy Framework, with the idea that we in the United States have to be leading on these issues. So only once you get these basic policies right can you start talking about AI. And this administration feels very strongly that innovation has to be at the forefront of what we're doing on AI. Everybody wants to talk about risks, everyone wants to talk about vulnerabilities, but by the way, when I say everybody, I mean everyone in the West. When you travel to Africa, when you travel to Asia, when you travel to South America, they're not talking about risk, except for what's the risk to their economies of not being at the forefront of AI development. Everyone in the world is looking to create innovation, and so that's what we're trying to do by making sure that there's not a regulatory environment that's overly burdensome, that's stifling innovation, because ultimately, if we stifle innovation, then we're going to find ourselves behind in this AI race, and instead, we need to be at the forefront to maintain US dominance in AI.
Great. There's a lot in there. We need
Can't help it, man.
Maintain U.S. dominance in AI across the entire stack. You talked about connectivity. You talked about other elements of the infrastructure, data centers or AI factories, as some have called them. And you talked about data. And what we didn't touch on are the models. But I think that those other components, that's really what we want to focus on here. What do you see as some of the challenges? We can pick any of those areas. Connectivity, infrastructure, or data, what are some of the biggest challenges you're seeing on the international front?
Well, I think, of course, from our point of view, there's lots of people who want to go with the cheap solution, even if it's not the best solution. So China will come in with a full stack AI situation, from connectivity to data centers to cloud, the whole thing, and be like, here's your AI, congratulations. But what you're doing is, and I think there's, if people say, essentially, if you've got a good price, the question is who's being bought, and it's you that's being bought. It's your data, it's your information. Ultimately, you have to think about that. And I think people are so desperate to be able to have access to this technology that they're willing to essentially give up their own information, their own future, their own sovereignty to China. And so I think the reality is that I think this is a massive issue around the world, is that we need to continue to say, look, AI can be amazing. It can power innovation. It can power development. It can help you decide where to plant crops, where to fish, how to do all these, address all the challenges that we face in the world. And it can be used to surveil, censor, and repress people. And I think when we get scared about it, it's because we in the West, that's what we're thinking about. Is that AI going to follow me from A to B? Is it going to see that I jaywalk? By the way, I'll acknowledge I jaywalk a lot. Hopefully no cops here. Also cross on reds on my bike. Hopefully I don't get hit. But but I don't think that I'm going to be receiving some, fine to my house from having been tracked down through cameras around the world, tracking every movement and using AI to determine it's me and sending me, ultimately a ticket for doing something that, okay, I shouldn't be doing, but, still. And so I think this is the biggest challenge. We have serious questions about how AI is going to act and how we are going to interact with it. And so ultimately, we are at a crossroads where we need to defend our way of life, and partially that does mean pushing back on Chinese AI.
You describe it as fundamentally a difference in values, the values that's embedded in technology. But there are those countries you mentioned before that want to take part in the AI revolution, and cost is so important. So what is the right approach? How do we address that?
Well, I think cost is always going to be a factor. And I do think for those in the private sector, trying to figure out if you have different cost structures, pricing models, et cetera, I think that the private sector is going to have to be part of the solution. Governments can't just make all the policy, by the way, without talking to the private sector, because, by the way, we'll end up making policy that's not the best usually, because we're working in a vacuum. Please don't ask me how AI actually works, right? I need to go and talk to the experts in the private sector. So the private sector has to be part of the solution. And I think they have to be part of the solution in a couple of ways. And this is where I think we can make a better offer. And the better offer has to do with things like skilling. The US private sector has done massive amounts of digital and cyber skilling around the world for decades and is still at the forefront. But if you talk to people, people forget that. They want to talk about Huawei academies. They don't want to talk about Cisco academies. They want to talk about all these other things. But if you go to the developing world and you say, and I did this a few years ago, I said, talk to me about Huawei academies. And I had a guy who said to me, Huawei academies, those don't do anything. You know what's great? I got a Cisco certificate 2 decades ago, and I learned how to be an engineer. And so it's not to give a call out to Cisco, because I could say the same about what Microsoft does, what Google does, what AWS does. I mean, on and on and on. The US private sector is out there training people every day and should continue to do that, because ultimately that's the first level. That's what everyone wants, is they want the skills. So how do the US private sector partner with the US government to provide the skills onto which you can then build on the questions of cloud, data centers, et cetera? And I think we need to continue to work together across the stack. The reality is the US government or the US private sector in very few cases is not going to say, here's the full stack. Instead, you're going to go with top of the class, cloud, top of the class data centers, top of the class connectivity, which might be from different companies, but ultimately you're going to end up with a better product. So we have to work together to give the offer and to demonstrate why spending, let's hope a little more, not a lot more, a little more is worth the outcome at the end. And by the way, if you can make a business case to countries, they absolutely will sign on. We've had this amazing success on subsea cables, and by the way, people will know I'm obsessed with subsea cables. But what's happened is, HMN Tech was making a serious run on subsea cables. And we started going with a partner around the world and saying, look, you want to land an HMN Tech cable, you can do that. But you're going to lose this round of customers who will not buy on this. And they essentially made the business case around trusted cables. And HMN Tech's share of cable technology has gone down since that because there is a business case. We are still, around the world, markets drive economies, even in countries where they are not as free as the United States.
I want to ask you a little bit about the CBPR forum.
Yeah.
There was a big announcement yesterday.
Yes.
The CBPR system has formally launched, a global CBPR system. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, we are really excited. Again, this was something that started in Asia, which is, by the way, also our subsea cable work started in Asia. Started small. But essentially, there was the idea of you needed to bring countries together to talk about how do you address concerns around privacy. I think even if we don't have federal privacy legislation in the United States, much to the chagrin of many of us in the federal government, the reality is everybody is concerned about privacy. And privacy can be used as I really appreciated your comments about, privacy is not always about privacy. Privacy can be actually about, I like to call it the anti-privacy laws, right? But there are situations where people want to ensure that their information is being used in appropriate ways. Well, how can you do that in a private sector-led way that anyone can sign on to without a massive bureaucracy that comes with data privacy authorities? What's interesting, right, and I'm going to make a little detour to talk about data privacy authorities because I've met with a lot of them around the world, and what we find around the world is a lot of people have adopted GDPR-type legislation and they don't know how to implement it. And it is really difficult to do so. What do you do if you are in, let's say, Egypt, and you're trying to convince small and medium-sized businesses that they have a responsibility on privacy? Are they going to understand what that means? Are they going to know how to do that? And if not, are they going to be fined massive amounts of money because they're, a corner store that hasn't figured out what it needs to do to meet the privacy laws? It is great to try to protect privacy, but what we've had around the world is a one-size-fits-all model that doesn't actually scale to the local environments in which it's being brought out. So that's why CBPR is really an amazing thing, so that you can have a private sector-led system where people can feel comfortable about their data being shared. Among the countries that announced recently that it was going to join CBPR was Nigeria. And I take this actually as a personal win, and I'll explain why, which is, usually I don't do this, but they were very skeptical, Nigeria. But Nigeria wanted to be a data hub. They're like, we want to be the regional data hub. And I said, okay, so you want to be the regional data hub, but you're requiring data localization, and you're not going to join CBPR. Explain to me why you think your neighbors should localize their data in your country when you say you don't think your data should leave Nigeria. You really should instead join this global forum in which you can say your data is going to be protected in Nigeria if you decide to go with our data centers. And ultimately, they started thinking about the business case, and they said, wow, actually, this makes a lot of sense. I think we will join. So
it's a great example, and it illustrates so many of the issues here. They have their domestic laws on data localization, yet from a business point of view, from an innovation point of view, they want to be a hub. So is that a playbook that you can use in negotiating with other countries?
Well, I'm a diplomat by profession at this point. I'm not going to say I'm a diplomat by training because, State Department, we only do so much on the training front, although we do train diplomats on our issues. So I think you've got to figure out what people want to achieve, right? What's the goal? And then you try to meet them where they're at. right? If you go in with the same talking points in every country, it's not going to work. People have different goals. They have different concerns. They have different issues that they're trying to solve, right? What I'm going to say in Nigeria is going to be different than what I'm going to say in India, where I also was very recently. And I was talking to them about data localization and how are they viewing these issues and what's their new data privacy framework and how is that going to either stifle or enable innovation. So it is, I mean, it's similar ideas, but it very much becomes focused on the place where you're at and understanding the person on the other side of the table.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I think that's such a valuable and wise way to approach these negotiations, and you obviously have a lot of experience. So we have just a couple of more minutes. I want to give you an opportunity to share, if you would, with us what 2 or 3 goals may be for the course of this year to try to address some of these issues.
I think it's going to be, I think my goals are sort of the same as they've been for a long time. We have to continue building out the State Department's ability to engage on these issues. As I said, so I've been with the State Department for 27 years. I believe really deeply in the mission of the State Department. And I believe deeply in the mission of the State Department because we're deployed around the world and we can figure out, again, how to meet people where they're at. What are they trying to do? What are their priorities? How can we meet those priorities while still maintaining our values, supporting U.S. companies, advancing U.S. national security, but in a way that's very tailored to the local economy and, by the way, informed by the private sector, NGOs, et cetera. So I think for me, continuing to build out the ability of U.S. diplomats to engage on these issues is one of our remaining goals. Because what I want is that if people travel, if you're a private sector company and you travel to Nigeria, you can call up the embassy and there's going to be somebody you can speak to who at least has some understanding of these issues. I think that it's so incredibly important that embassies can be sort of the advancement of the U.S. foreign policy. So that's one issue. I would say, I will just go with the elephant in the room. The State Department's undergoing a reorganization. I think it's no reason to pretend we're not. The reorganization will affect my entity. It will affect how we do things and making sure that we continue to advance our interests in a way that makes sense and that aligns with our sort of way of viewing the world. I think we need to continue to work on our mandate. We need to not really miss a beat during a time that is where there's a lot going on, both externally in the world, but also internally. So what I tell the team all the time when they say to me, like, okay, what should we do? How do we help you in this time of reorganization? I say, do your jobs, do it well, show your value. And so there is, this is a lot of very internally focused things, and I guess maybe it's because, as you see, it says acting head of bureau, which means that my actual job was to be the number 2 in the bureau, which means that it's really about the internal, but I don't think we can be successful in the world unless we have our internal stuff. And so finally, I think number 3 would be to continue to build out friends, allies, partners around the world who understand the issues that we're facing and who want to partner together to push back against the destabilizing efforts of adversaries like China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and as well, I'll mention ransomware actors. I think we have to continue to build out the coalition that's going to stand up to the challenges we see in the world. So I guess that would be my 3rd one. But I think you have to do 1 and 2 to get to 3.
Great. Thank you so much.